Hello dear students, I am Ms. K.D. Patil from the Department of Information Technology, Sanjeevani College of Engineering. Welcome you all for the lecture series of Object-Oriented Programming. In this lecture, we are going to see the different programming languages, procedure-oriented programming, object-oriented programming, and the difference between procedure-oriented programming with object-oriented programming. At the end of this lecture, student will able to introduce the object-oriented programming as well as student will able to differentiate the procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming. As we know that different programming languages are used to express the computations that can be performed by the computer. They are used to create the programs that control the behavior of a system to express algorithms or can be used as a mode of communication with the computer. Different programming languages have different syntax and vocabulary. When the software is developed using these different programming languages, the software products should be evaluated carefully for their quality before they are implemented and delivered. The quality issues such as correctness, maintainability, reusability, openness, portability, security, integrity, and user friendliness need to be checked. Portability is the ability of a software to move from one place to the another place, and integrity is the ability of a software to check the data safeguard from the unauthorized person. To design such softwares which access all those qualities, the different programming languages like machine language, assembly language, procedure-oriented languages, and object-oriented languages are used. Machine language is the first language which is used for programming. It is the only language that computer understands. All commands and data values are expressed in terms of zeros and ones in this machine language. The programs can be directly executed by the computer when we write the program in the machine language, and they are easy. The execution is fast and efficient. Programs can be written to effectively utilize the memory, but some of the disadvantages like the code is difficult to write and understand and maintain. There is a more possibility of errors and it is very difficult to detect and correct those errors. In the machine language, the code is machine dependent and thus not portable. So the next generation language, that is assembly language, comes into the picture. Assembly language is also a low level language which is similar to the machine language that exists between the machine languages and high level languages. Only the difference between machine language and the assembly language is that it allows the programmer to substitute names for the numbers. It uses symbolic codes which are easy to remember, such as add, compare, etc. It consists of labels which are used to identify and refer the instructions in the program. It uses opcode which is used to specify the operation to be performed. As an example, add ADD, as well as it uses operands which are used to specify the registers or the locations in the main memory where the data to be processed or located. The instructions and statements vary from the machine to machine, and thus the assembly language is also not portable. To execute the program, assembly language required one software which converts that program into the machine code called as an assembler. The code is easy to understand, easy to write the programs than the machine language. The errors are easy to detect and correct than the machine language, and as compared to the machine language, in assembly language, the modification we can modify the code easily. But as the code is not portable, and as it required the extra assembler to convert the code into the machine language, those languages are not used nowadays, and the new language comes into the picture, that is procedure oriented programming language. The procedure-oriented programming languages are consist of writing a list of instructions for computer to follow and organize these instructions into the groups called as a functions. If you observe the figure, the procedure-oriented languages focus more on functions. They uses hierarchical decomposition to specify the task to be completed for solving the problems. Hierarchical decomposition is the method where the system is divided into subsystem and then the subsystem is divided into functions or subroutines and then those functions are divided into modules to complete the task. If you observe the figure, the main program is divided into number of subprograms, that is subroutines, called as a functions. In the procedure oriented language, the more focus is on functions rather than the data. uh, each each function consists of local data, and with that local data function can access the global data. All the data items which can be used can be placed in the global data so that that data can be accessed by the functions in the program. The data move around the system from function to function. The global data are vulnerable as it is difficult to identify what data is used by which function, as the data items are placed can be placed globally and any function anytime can be used that global data. In the procedure oriented programming languages, as I told you, global data is vulnerable. It does not model the real world problems very well because the functions are action oriented and does not correspond to the real world objects. In the procedure oriented programming, the program code is harder to write as well as the code is not reusable. If we want to reuse that code, then we need to modify the program more. It will be better to write the new code. Then, because of these disadvantages, the new programming language come into the picture, that is object-oriented programming language. It is an approach to program the organization and development that attempts to eliminate some of the pitfalls of conventional programming languages, which we have already seen in assembly language programming, machine language programming, and procedure-oriented programming. In object-oriented programming, the data is treated as a critical element in the program development. It does not allow data to flow freely around the system. The decomposition of the problem is divided into number of entities called as objects. In the object-oriented programming, the data and functions are built around the objects. If you can see in the figure, this is the organization of data and functions in the procedure-oriented programming. If you see the figure, with each function data is associated and that data is privately associated. The functions can use that data which is associated with object A, then the data which is associated with object B can be used by the function which is associated with the object B only. The data of an object can be accessed only by the functions associated with that objects. Functions of one object can access the functions of another object. For example, if we have object A, object B, and object C, the function of object A can communicate or can access the data of function of object B or object C, as well as the data can be accessed through those functions only. The communication will happen in object-oriented programming through the functions only. Directly, the data cannot be accessed by the other functions which are not associated with respect to that respective object. These are some important features of object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming focuses on data rather than the procedures. Programs are divided into the objects. Data structures are designed in such a way that they characterize the objects. Data is hidden and not accessible to outside the functions. Objects may communicate with each other through the functions only. New data and functions can be easily added whenever necessary. Procedure-oriented programming follows the top-down approach, whereas the object-oriented programming follows the bottom-up approach. Let us define the object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming can be defined as the approach that provides a way of modularization programs by creating the partition memory area for both data and functions that can be used as a templates for creating the copies of such modules on demands. Let us differentiate the procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming. As we have already seen, procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming can be seen as POP or OOP. In procedure-oriented programming, the program is divided into functions that perform the specific task, whereas in object-oriented programming, the program is divided into objects. Procedure-oriented programming follows the top-down approach and object-oriented programming follows the bottom-up approach. Let us see what is top-down approach and bottom-up approach. In the top-down approach, if we can see in the figure, a module is divided into the different modules. It is a stepwise refinement by decomposing the problem into manageable modules. In the top-down approach, the reusability of components is very difficult. Each module and submodules are processed separately and hence they might contain the redundant information. But in the bottom-up approach, object-oriented programming follows the bottom-up approach. First, the modules are defined and then those modules are grouped together to perform the high-level module, to define a higher level model. Object-oriented programming, as it follows the bottom-up approach, reusability of components is easy as first the modules are defined and then they are grouped together. Bottom-up approach relies on data encapsulation, data hiding, and thereby it minimizes the redundancy. What is data encapsulation and data hiding? We will see in the next lectures of this object-oriented programming lecture series. The next difference is, as I told you, the procedure-oriented programming focus on how to get the task done, that is on the procedure or structure of the program, whereas the object-oriented programming more focus on data security and hence the objects are permitted to access the entities of a class. Now what is class, what is object, we will see in the next lectures. There are access specifiers available in object-oriented programming like public, private, and protected, whereas in the procedure-oriented programming, no access specifiers available. Procedure-oriented programming is useful for the small problems, whereas object-oriented programming is useful for large and complex problems as reusability is possible and as it follows the bottom-up approach, the modules can be defined first and it is easy to correct and detect the errors from the small modules. Procedure-oriented programming is less secure. In the procedure-oriented programming, data is less secure as most of the data items are placed globally and that data items can be accessed by all the functions over all the system. Whereas in object-oriented programming, the data is more secure as only the functions associated with that respective object can access that data. In the procedure-oriented programming, the global data is shared among the functions as I told you, and in object-oriented programming, the data is shared among the objects through the member functions only. In the procedure-oriented programming, the new data and functions cannot be added easily, whereas in the object-oriented programming, the new data and functions can be added easily. The procedure-oriented programming do not have the characteristics like virtual class, virtual function, operator overloading, polymorphism, friend functions, friend classes, inheritance, etc. But in the object-oriented programming, all those characteristics are added. The different examples of procedure-oriented programming are C, Fortran, Pascal, VB, etc. Whereas the different examples of object-oriented programming are C++, Java, VB.NET, etc. I hope all of you have understood the difference between procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming, as well as I hope you understood what is procedure-oriented programming and object-oriented programming. Let us see in the next lecture the next part. Thank you so much.